The millionaire had not been home in almost 12 years. A span of time that seemed both like a blink and an eternity when he stood before the iron gates of the mansion he once called a prison, and later a monument to his own ambition, his heart thundering against his ribs as though reminding him that despite all the money, power, and cold success he had amassed, he was still flesh, still blood, still a son. And as the gates creaked open with that familiar metallic groan that carried 100 childhood memories within it, he felt the tremor of something deeper than nostalgia, something closer to fear, though he would never admit that to himself, not even now, not even when his Rolls-Royce idled behind him, engine humming like the voice of the empire he had built from his father's ashes, because tonight he had decided not to announce his arrival. Tonight he had chosen to walk in unannounced and see his mother as she was, not as the polished caretaker updates described her, not as the filtered versions delivered by lawyers and doctors had framed her decline, but as she really was. A woman who had once been iron-willed, brilliant, unflinching in the face of scandal, yet who now, so they said, drifted like a ghost through corridors of memory fractured by the cruelty of Alzheimer's, sometimes remembering his name, sometimes staring at walls as if searching for it, and sometimes weeping without knowing why, though the part that twisted his gut most was the image of her alone, surrounded by strangers, her only son gone, her husband buried, her past reduced to flickering shadows of clarity. And so he pushed through the doors of the house that still smelled faintly of cedar and lemon oil, his polished shoes clicking against marble tiles that had once reflected the wild laughter of his younger self, chasing golden retrievers across the foyer. And he thought of how money had pulled him away, how ambition had convinced him he was honoring his mother by building wealth, by proving her sacrifices had not been wasted. But now he questioned if absence had been betrayal, if the skyscrapers in New York, the villas in Monaco, the boardrooms where he was hailed as a visionary, had been worth missing the one simple truth, that his mother, fragile or strong, had wanted him, not his empire. And as he turned into the living room expecting silence, expecting perhaps the murmur of a nurse's voice or the low buzz of a television left on to soothe her, what he found instead stopped him mid-step, air caught in his lungs as if someone had stolen the very oxygen from the house. For there, kneeling beside the grand piano that had not been tuned in years, was a black woman in a plain gray dress, her head bowed, her hands clasped over his mother's frail fingers, lips moving in whispered prayer, and beside her his mother, hair now silver and skin marked with time's lines, eyes half closed but shimmering with tears, her trembling hands folded within the younger woman's, her lips moving too, echoing the prayer in a fragile, broken cadence that shook him more than any hostile boardroom takeover, more than any financial collapse or scandal he had navigated, because this was not in the reports. This was not in the filtered narratives. This was his mother, not lost but somehow found, tethered not by medicine but by faith, by this stranger who knelt with her as though she were her own blood. And for a long moment he stood, a towering silhouette in the doorway, unnoticed, unable to speak, his thoughts crashing like waves, pride clashing with guilt, suspicion clashing with awe, until finally his mother opened her eyes and whispered a name. Not his, but Grace, and the woman raised her head slowly, revealing eyes that had seen hardship yet carried light, a face that was neither startled nor ashamed but serene, as if she had known he would one day walk in, as if she had been expecting him all along. And though 1,000 questions boiled on his tongue, "Who are you? Why are you here? How dare you take liberties in my home?" None left his lips because the room itself seemed hushed by something larger than him, a holiness he had never believed in but could not deny. And in that silence his mother smiled faintly, the kind of smile he had not seen since childhood, and whispered again, "She prays for me when I forget how," and the words landed heavier than any deal, heavier than any fortune, because he realized then that this woman, Grace, had given his mother what he had not, presence, touch, and the patience of faith, and though he wanted to resent her, wanted to reclaim his mother from her hands, he could not, because in those clasped fingers he saw something money could never buy. And so he stepped forward, finally making his presence known, voice hoarse with something dangerously close to humility as he said, "Mother," and both women turned, the younger rising gracefully, the elder gasping with a glimmer of recognition that might have been memory, or might have been love transcending memory. And for the first time in decades the millionaire felt like a boy again, caught between two women, one who had given him life, and one who was now giving her dignity back, drop by drop, prayer by prayer. For a moment the millionaire's throat closed, as though the sheer weight of everything left unsaid between him and his mother had risen all at once, pressing down on his chest, suffocating him in the silence of his own delayed homecoming. And Grace, the housekeeper who had been praying with his mother, lowered her gaze respectfully but did not shrink away, her presence calm, steady, as though she had learned long ago that storms, no matter how fierce, must be met with stillness. And the millionaire, whose name was Alexander, though everyone in the world seemed to call him Mr. Cross, with a mixture of reverence and fear, felt a strange heat in his face when his mother's fragile fingers reached out, trembling, as though searching the air for something her mind half remembered. And when they finally brushed the sleeve of his coat, her eyes widened in recognition, cloudy yet piercing, and she whispered, "My boy," a phrase so simple it nearly unmade him, because for years he had rehearsed what he might say, what excuses he might craft for his absence, how he might justify the chase for wealth that had kept him oceans away. But those two words stripped every defense bare, reminding him that no empire built on glass towers could replace the truth of belonging to someone who loved him before he had a name in the world. And so he knelt, awkwardly at first, like a man unaccustomed to humility, but then fully, pressing his lips against her papery hand, breathing in the faint scent of lavender lotion, the same brand she had always used, and his tears fell unbidden, shocking him more than her frailty, because Alexander Cross had not cried in decades, not when his father's coffin was lowered into the earth, not when his first company nearly collapsed under betrayal, not when lovers left or when enemies attacked. Yet here, before this silver-haired woman who sometimes forgot his name, he wept like a child, and Grace, silent as a shadow, laid a hand gently on his shoulder, her touch grounding but unintrusive, as though she understood without words that the son and mother needed this moment more than anything. And when he finally found his voice hoarse and uneven, he murmured, "I should have come sooner." And his mother smiled faintly, her eyes misting, and said, "You came now," which in its simplicity felt like both absolution and indictment, for it meant that despite all the lost years, she was not interested in what was gone, only in the now. And yet he, Alexander, could not forgive himself so easily, because the echoes of time haunted him. The birthdays missed, the holidays skipped, the moments where she might have reached for the phone and found only silence on the other end. And as he wrestled with this guilt, he looked at Grace again, truly seeing her for the first time, not as an intruder in his home, but as the quiet guardian who had been with his mother when he was not. And he noticed the weariness etched in her face, the faint calluses on her hands, signs of long hours of care, yet also the peace in her eyes, the peace of someone who believed in purpose beyond recognition. And he felt the stirrings of a question. Who was she really? This woman who had somehow brought his mother back from the fog long enough to call him "my boy"? He rose to his feet, helping his mother settle back against the armchair, tucking the knitted blanket over her knees the way she had once tucked him in as a child. And then he turned, meeting Grace's gaze with the directness of a man who was used to answers, and said, "You've been caring for her?" The words sounded clumsy, almost foolish in their obviousness. But Grace nodded, her voice low, steady, carrying traces of a southern lilt as she replied, "Every day. Mr. Cross, she is never alone." That sentence struck him, never alone, because it carried an implicit reminder that his absence had not left her abandoned. Not entirely, that while he had chased wealth, someone else had stepped into the void. Not for money, not for power, but for compassion. And he felt both gratitude and envy swelling inside him, tangled together in a knot that he could not immediately untangle. So he asked the next question his pride demanded. Why? Grace looked at him unflinching, as though she saw straight through the polished exterior of his bespoke suit, the carefully controlled posture, and into the restless boy who had once sat on those very floors and cried because his father had missed another recital. And her reply was simple. "Because God asked me to." Those words landed heavier than he expected. Not because he believed. He had long dismissed faith as superstition, a crutch for the weak. But because she said them without hesitation, without defensiveness, and with a conviction that seemed carved into her very being. And he realized then that Grace was not in his house because of salary or obligation. She was there because she had chosen to anchor herself beside his mother's fading light, to speak prayers into the silence of her forgetfulness, to remind her of a God Alexander himself had never acknowledged. And something inside him twisted with both skepticism and awe. His mother stirred then, murmuring softly, fragments of hymn lyrics she half remembered. her voice breaking yet strangely beautiful. And Grace began to sing with her, low and gentle, her voice rich, carrying the melody so that his mother could follow along. And as the room filled with that quiet music, Alexander stood frozen, caught between the rational world of stock markets and mergers and this fragile world of faith, memory, and song, a world he had abandoned long ago but which now seemed to hold more truth than anything he had built. And he realized with a pang that maybe he had been wrong all these years. Maybe success was not skyscrapers and private jets, but the ability to sit, to kneel, to hold someone's hand when they forgot who you were, to pray when they forgot how, and the weight of that revelation nearly buckled him. He cleared his throat, forcing the businessman's mask back over his face, and said, "I'll be staying a while." Though the words felt foreign on his tongue, because he never stayed anywhere. Always moving, always chasing, but here now, he knew he could not leave, not yet. Not when there was so much to mend, and Grace simply nodded, as though she had known this too, and returned her attention to his mother, who had dozed off with a faint smile, clutching the edge of the blanket as though it were a lifeline, leaving Alexander standing in the living room of his childhood home, feeling both like an intruder and like a prodigal, knowing the journey ahead would not be measured in miles or dollars, but in hours spent by his mother's side, hours he had once squandered but could now perhaps redeem.